in our discussion series, The Cure, Healing an Epidemic of Loneliness. And last week, we began this series by talking about a lot of the research that's gone into what it means to be lonely and how it's affecting us and our health, in our culture, and as a society, and what that's really been looking like. And we said that if it's damaging to us emotionally and physically, that it's probably damaging to us spiritually as well. And we looked at what it takes to heal that. And so we said that loneliness is a very real issue. It's affecting every generation, whereas it used to affect maybe people who had lost a lot of loved ones and were older. We see now that every generation seems to be affected by loneliness, and we're missing the full life that God intends for us. This fullness that God has planned for us. And as we look at this, I want to kind of first a reminder of what loneliness is and isn't. So we said first off that loneliness isn't just being alone or being isolated. Certainly these two things can cause loneliness, but we know people, and maybe you know people that don't struggle with loneliness and they spend time alone, and that doesn't it doesn't cause them loneliness. But we also know you can have people in your life and still be lonely. That you can be around people and still feel loneliness. And so I want to have a running definition for us of loneliness, and it's simply this: loneliness is the deep sense of dread and the persistent idea that you have no one and you are no one. Maybe you're struggling with this right now. Maybe you read that definition and you go, yeah, that's me. Or maybe you can remember a time where this was you. I think this is an incredibly human element to think about, and a very human thing to experience. And so we said that the cure for loneliness isn't necessarily people, but it's presence. It's the idea of being present with people, and even being present to yourself, maybe when alone. And we said that real presence begins, and it happens, and it continues, and it builds, and it grows, and develops through vulnerability. And we said that vulnerability is opening ourselves up to being known and cared for, and knowing and caring for others. But vulnerability is very, very difficult. Vulnerability is so hard to do because, as some people like to describe it, as feeling just completely naked, or there's a fear associated with it, like it's an open wound. And vulnerability can be very difficult. But we said that being open to being known and cared for, and caring and knowing others, we said there's three different levels of this. If these were concentric circles, they would start out here with this broader community, this community where you belong, you feel belonging, you know, these are my people, this is my tribe, this is a group that I belong to. And maybe you have several of those within your community. Maybe it's things you're a part of within the city. Maybe it is your neighborhood, or it could be this very community of faith here you see as your broader community. And we said that there's a level of vulnerability that happens within community, but then you kind of pull in a little bit. It's this idea of companionship, and this has to do with like the friendship, or the intimacy that is found through close friendships, and it kind of brings the next circle in. And maybe there's only a few people like that, and maybe you have this broader community, but it's those people you feel like you can be especially close with, that you're partnering with in life. Maybe even a partner in life, like a spouse, someone to walk this thing known as life together with. And maybe that's what's missing in your life, or maybe you're missing community. And then we kind of go in even further, a little more laser focused. At the center of that is this idea of communion. And this is our life of faith, and the connection that we have to God through our faith. And maybe that's what's missing. Maybe you feel like there's no connection to the divine. I don't understand what that means. And I want to know God. I want that aspect in my life. I want to have a spirituality that is vulnerable and open. but you're struggling, maybe that's the missing piece. And I think loneliness, as we go in and out, these all affect each other. And so we're going to look at Jesus, because I believe that Jesus models these various relationships for those closest to him, and then they would write about it. And so over the next few weeks, we're going to talk about communion, companionship, and community, and how we can become vulnerable. We can open ourselves up to these things, right? To be known and cared for, and to know and care for others in this way. And I believe that if we can find this in our life, that is where we begin to start healing from the sense of loneliness and the sense of dread in our life. So here we go. Let's jump into communion. Now, here's how I would describe communion. It's faith and vulnerability over time. That's really what all of these are. All of these elements take time. So sometimes we want things to be immediate. Maybe you remember that time where you started going to church, and maybe you began to have some kind of experience with God, or maybe even with a person, like this connection, and you wanted that thing to happen immediately, but it just doesn't happen that way. Real vulnerability takes time. If vulnerability is immediate, it tends to be manipulative. And you have to be careful for that. Maybe you know people that just try and give themselves fully to someone else. They're not healthy if that is an immediate thing. And so this takes time, even when it comes to our spiritual communion, our spiritual connection to God. It is faith and vulnerability over time. So let's look at some examples of Jesus, where I'm going to just quickly give a few verses from every gospel account. And the gospels were simply this: it was people who directly followed Jesus, or people that interviewed people who followed Jesus, and they begin to write these stories down. They begin to write about this person that meant so much to them. And so we're going to look into the gospels, and we're going to see how can we follow Jesus in these levels of vulnerability. So here we go. Talking about communion. Look at the example of Jesus. It says, after sending them home, he went up to the hills by himself to pray. Night fell while he was there alone. Another place it says, then Jesus went with them to the olive grove called Gethsemane, and he said, sit here while I go over there and pray. You're going to see a little theme here that I think is going to help us. Keep reading. In Mark 1, it says, the Spirit then compelled Jesus to go into the wilderness. And maybe you're familiar with the story of the temptation of Jesus. This was happened in the wilderness, and it says the Spirit compelled him to go into the wilderness and be alone. Another place it says, before daybreak the next morning, Jesus got up and went out to an isolated place to pray. Are you finding the thread here? In Luke was a doctor, and he was so fascinated by this person of Jesus, and he went around and interviewing people that were with him in his life, and he wrote the story down. And it says, early next morning, Jesus went out to an isolated place. And later he says, but Jesus often withdrew to the wilderness for prayer. In every gospel, we find this practice of Jesus. We find this pattern. It says in John, when Jesus saw they were ready to force him to be their king, he slipped away into the hills by himself. John 12, it says, after saying these things, Jesus went away and was hidden from them. I think it's pretty easy to see the common thread in this. And while the Gospels are very similar, there's very few things that you find in all four Gospels. But one of them is this pattern of Jesus where he would pull himself away from people, where he would isolate himself to what we see is to practice communion, to be alone with God, to be present to who he referred to as Father. And this required him to pull away from people. So I want to look at this pattern of Jesus. If you go into those verses and you kind of read context, you can find more about what and why he did this. But I want to kind of quickly go into this pattern of practicing communion. And I want us to look at it and think, what can we learn from this? What can we add to our life from this that maybe is missing? And what can we do to begin this cure for the loneliness that we are feeling at some level? And I think especially all of us at some level maybe feel distant and alone when it comes to our spirituality, when it comes to our relationship to God. So let's continue. First off, we see in this pattern, we see retreat, right? Solitude becomes the cure for loneliness. Now, this is very interesting, right? Because one would imagine if I want to be cured from loneliness, I need to be around people. And what we see here is that Jesus is no, spiritually, it's important to disconnect from people, to retreat from people, and to be alone with your spirit, the Spirit of God, connecting. And we see this in the life of Jesus, where he isolated himself, where he retreated from the work that he was doing and the people with which he was doing the work. One of the things that I found to be an incredibly helpful practice when I started, I had a leadership coach that I began with a few years ago, and just a wise man who wanted the best for me, and I knew it, I could tell. And one of the first practice that he instituted with me to help me was a retreat. And so this happens monthly, where I have a retreat day in my calendar. And it's not because I don't love being with people. It's because I need to consciously have a practice where I'm pulling away from people and I'm present to my spirit and the Spirit of God in that connection and that relationship. Why? Because it takes time. Not only do I do that once a month, I try and do it 2 or 3 times a year where I go away and I spend time. Listen, folks, that's not just for a pastor. That's a practice for all of us, to find ways to retreat into a place of connection. For Jesus, he would go into the wilderness. He would go into the garden. He would go out by the lake. We see him walking by the lake these early mornings. He would find a place to retreat from the people so he could connect and be present to himself in God. And at that point, solitude becomes the cure for our loneliness. But then also we saw that when Jesus was away, he would pray and he would fast. And this was him getting in tune with God and himself. Have you ever just felt distracted even from your own self? Have you ever sat down to pray and that prayer felt short? Like, I don't even have the words to say today, right? And it's because there's so much noise. And so this retreat is so important and for the life of prayer. We see Jesus pray at other times and with people and all this, but to get away and to really connect and be in tune with yourself is so important. We see that in the life and ministry of Jesus. But we also see this practice of fasting that kind of tends to go along with prayer. And fasting is simply this. It's I'm going to depend less on something physical so I can deepen my spiritual connection. I know a lot of people that are like, oh, I could never fast. I could never fast. And I was one of those people. Fasting seemed weird to me. It seemed unnecessary. And then I tried it, just tried it with some friends. Hey, we're going to take these 3 weeks and we're going to fast. And this was a food-based fast. And it was actually a very healthy thing for mind, body, and spirit. But when I did that, what I realized is, when Jesus was fasting, some things in life, some aspects of faith just happen better and differently, and they were more connected to that experience when we've fasted in connection to our prayer. Maybe you are wanting to really connect with God and you have something in your life you don't know how, you just don't know how, you don't know what you can do to make this thing better, to make this thing happen, this next step of faith. I know God wants it, but I don't know. I would encourage you, pray and fast. Retreat and pray and fast. But here's the next part, and this is very important, is the aspect of return. Right? Retreat always begins with the desire to return. Jesus retreated, he isolated, but he did not stay there. Jesus wasn't a monk in a monastery or some hermit up on the hill. No, Jesus was actively involved in the lives of people. And to be present to those people, he had to be present to himself and to God in this divine communion. But this retreat always had the purpose of returning back to people. And that's the idea of when we are pouring into that relationship, we're spending time in that relationship with God and ourselves. The goal is always to return to the world a better, more whole, healthy person spiritually, and then also socially and emotionally. And then we see this last act of this pattern is there's retreat, pray, return, act. Faith is an action verb. This faith and vulnerability isn't just I'm trusting that God is hearing my prayers, but it's the idea that I'm trusting God that he has a purpose for me. And that when I'm connected to that purpose here, it connects me to that purpose in the world. So we retreat to pray, to fast, to practice being in tune with God and ourselves, but we return to act on the faith that grew and is growing in that relationship. It's like this. Maybe when you think of communion, you think of maybe a practice, a ritual, a tradition that you had in your church, and for some of us it was a cracker and juice or bread and wine, and you took this in, and this was I'm taking in Jesus, the body and blood of Jesus, and I'm accepting this. And for a lot of people, this is a very it's a very connecting experience to do this on a regular, maybe a regular pattern of some sort. But ultimately, communion is so much more than bread and wine or the cracker and the juice at your church. And it took me a long time to get to this. That those things were a picture of something else. Those things were a picture of what God had for me all the time. Look at this quote that I think will really help us understand it. It says, "Once your life has become a constant communion." Think about that. A constant communion. Communion is this intimate friendship. And more often than not, communion kind of insinuates that it's this intimate friendship between the human and the divine. It's once your life has become this constant communion. Isn't that the goal? Like, isn't that part of the cure of loneliness, is constant communion? Faith and vulnerability over time. You know that all the techniques, the formulas, sacraments, and practices were just a dress rehearsal for the real thing, life itself, which can actually become a constant, intentional prayer. Your conscious and loving existence gives glory to God. It's this right here. It's this idea. Spiritual vulnerability opens us up to divine participation in the world. It is this thing that all of life becomes communion. All of life becomes a way to connect to the divine. But I think this happens through an intentional practice of retreat, prayer, fasting, return, and action, acting on this connection. But the reason it opens us up to divine participation in the world is this. Our relationship to God is always personal. Excuse me. Our relationship to God is always personal, but it is rarely private. People are watching. Now, maybe that is highlighted, and maybe I feel it as a magnifying glass because I have this title or this ordination of pastor, right? And so people want to know, well, what's this person like who calls himself that? But I would say anyone who identifies with the divine, with some kind of maybe tradition or practice of spirituality, people are watching. They want to know, does this kind of thing in a person's life matter? I think when they looked at Jesus, they saw, as all of the Gospels record, he went away and he did this, and this was part of his pattern routine. Why? Because it mattered to the life and ministry of Jesus. And maybe if you're in here today and you follow Jesus as I do, you see this kind of pattern as integral to your life because people are watching and because you're participating in the world around you. Look at this prayer by Jesus in this moment where his disciples were there and he went into the garden and he prays this prayer. And it says, I'm praying not only for these disciples, the ones that are right here, but also for all who will ever believe in me through their message. I pray that they will all be one, just as you and I are one. Remember, he's talking to God. He referred to Father, this relational connection. It says, as you are in me, Father, and I am in you, and may they be in us so that the world will believe you sent me. That when we connect ourselves to God in this manner that Jesus did, and we connect ourselves to Jesus and to Spirit, and we are truly living out of that connection, out of a healing that is happening in this very core relationship, when we do that, the world begins to look in and see us and believe. Believe what? I think this, believe that Jesus was exactly who Jesus said he was. To believe that he really was from God. To believe that he really is love. When we do that, we get to participate with God in the world, in this mission. And so here's our idea worth discussing today. Our commitment to practicing communion will determine our experience of divine presence. So here's the question. What are your disciplines? What are your practices that are developing that relationship with God, where you have this faith that is open to God and you practice it over time? What are your practices? Maybe you're like, well, I come to church, I'm a part of these discussions, and that's kind of my practice, and it's been helpful. And I would say that's great. That's a great communal practice that we do together, and it connects us with God because we see the divine and the people across from us. And this is a big deal. This is a big connection point for you. But I would say this: what are your personal practices that are growing that relationship with God? So here's my challenge for you this week. To ask yourself that question, and then for 5 days this week, this is a 5-day challenge. I'm going to post about this on our social media and stuff like that, but a 5-day challenge. Here's what I would love for you. I want you to think of one thing you can do for 5 days in a row, starting tomorrow. What's one thing you can do for 5 days in a row that will connect you with God? Maybe this is a practice that you used to have, you don't anymore, and you would love to reconnect. Maybe this is a practice you've never done before, but you see that it could be helpful, or maybe you're interested in it. Or it could be a practice that you're already doing and you want to go further with it. 5 days in a row, one thing. And I'm going to tell you, here's how to do it. Because it's easy to throw a challenge out there, but I want to kind of coach you a little bit on here's how to do it. First off, find the time and then set a reminder. Find the time and set a reminder. One of the things that I did with my personal retreat days when I started my coaching is I put it into a calendar, and I put it like I had a meeting all day that day and this was an important meeting and it could not move. And who was that meeting with? Well, the meeting was with God, right? And it was important. It was the most important thing that could happen on that day. And I put it in my calendar and it didn't move. And I would encourage you, find that time in your calendar, put it in there and set a reminder, and then spend the time. Maybe it's 15 minutes, and maybe you got to turn some things off because you've got 15 minutes that you want to develop this practice. You want it to become a habit. You want to dive into it. So you find the time, set a reminder, you spend the time, and then reflect on it. Maybe before bed that night, or maybe an hour later, you look back and just maybe jot some thoughts down somewhere and reflect on that time. Ask yourself, how was that meeting with God? How was that time spent with God? Were you vulnerable? How were you vulnerable? What are you trusting God for that only God can do in your life? Why? Why would we even do this? Well, because if we aren't committed to practicing communion, we won't experience the presence of God like we think we really want to. It doesn't just happen. It happens over time. And it's so important for what we do in the world and every other relationship and every other aspect of being vulnerable.